Nuestra primera ponencia, con este punto de partida, corre a cargo de un reconocido consultor en puertos y en logística a nivel mundial, como es Peter de Langen. Desde su consultora, Ports and Logistic Advisory, realiza contribuciones de alto impacto, participando activamente en asesoramiento, en investigación, también en educación ejecutiva, en puertos y en logística a nivel mundial. De hecho, trabaja con empresas y con gobiernos que son líderes en la industria portuaria. Entre ellos, por citar solo algunos, el puerto de Rotterdam, que es el más grande, como saben, a nivel europeo, también el de Barcelona, el Banco Asiático de Desarrollo, las Naciones Unidas o la apertura o la autoridad, queremos decir, del Canal de Panamá. Peter de Langen, estamos deseando escucharte. Welcome to this Congress.
Muchas gracias a la Autoridad Portuaria de Bilbao para la invitación. No es la primera vez que estoy en Bilbao. La primera vez fue hace más o menos 15 años, cuando trabajé en la Autoridad Portuaria de Rotterdam y fuimos a un evento de Expo, la Intermodal Committee en su día en Bilbao. Y así puedo experimentar la hospitalidad tremenda que tiene la gente de Bilbao. Entonces es un placer de volver a estar aquí. Aunque vivo ya mucho tiempo en Málaga, voy a hablar en inglés, porque así doy un toque europeo al Congreso y creo que es mejor que me escuchas en inglés, porque me defiendo bien con mis amigos en Málaga, pero cuando quiero transmitir ideas importantes voy mejor en inglés. So, I would like to share with you a couple of the things that I think I've learned over time about ports and port development. And I will do so more or less unbothered by too much local knowledge. I've, of course, listened carefully to all the introduction, and that does leave a very good taste. But I'm going to talk really in very general terms, and the kind of the more precise discussions about Bilbao will certainly follow later. If everything that I'm sharing with you is already familiar to you, then please take that as a conclusion that you are very much an expert in ports development as much as I am. With most of the work I do in ports, I always start with this starting point, saying that ports are business ecosystems that really are much broader than terminals and cranes alone. I think there is a tendency in the media, sometimes also in the outside world, to reduce a port a little bit. And I think looking ahead, actually the biggest challenge for most ports is to make sure their ecosystems are vital. And the biggest challenges, I think, often are not so much in the terminals as they are in logistics activities, in industrial activities, and also in leisure activities. So that is really always the departing point that I take when talking about ports. Then really, what's the biggest challenge in ports? Well, that is that they operate in such a rapidly evolving environment, while at the same time all of the decisions take a lot of time, all of the investments take a lot of time, and the investments are fixed for a very long period. So you have to operate in a very dynamic world, and in that dynamic world you have to make decisions that have very long-lasting implications. So the capacity to adapt to the world as it is changing is difficult everywhere, but especially difficult for ports. And I think here, if I try and understand why some ports have a difficult time and why some projects don't create value, that is often because there is a temptation to think that the world of tomorrow will roughly be the same as the world of today. And that imports, and in most aspects of life, is a very difficult, very problematic assumption. So in developing ports, we know one thing for sure, that the world of tomorrow will not be the world as we know it. So business as usual is a very dangerous mindset. And because it is such a dangerous mindset, I think the challenge really for ports is to be able to kind of make a broad analysis of how the world is changing. And the port is impacted by so many aspects and so many dimensions that I think it's helpful to use a framework like the one that I've done here. I'm not going to go into all the details, that forces you to take the broad view. I think, again, there is a risk to look at ports and then say, well, we see some trends in shipping. Yeah, okay. Of course, the trends in shipping are important, but how about the trends in geopolitics? How about the trends in value chains? How about the trends in circularity? So I think this bigger picture really is something that ports need to understand very well to be able to develop their strategies going forward. And for today, I've singled out, let's say, these 4 elements that you see there, that I think are somewhat of the bigger, you can call them mega trends if you want, somewhat of the bigger challenges as ports face. And these really have an important implication for how to develop ports going forward. So the first one goes into population and demographics, because ultimately demographics are a very important driver of the economy. Over the past years, over the past decades, we've seen substantial economic growth, to a large extent also driven by population dynamics. Those population dynamics are really at a inflection point. As you can see on the graph over there, in Europe, we are facing a population decline. The only scenario in which we don't is a scenario with pretty massive integration, and that is a scenario that doesn't look very realistic at the moment. So in Europe, this is something that we have to incorporate, and it will have important effects on overall economic growth, on our potential to trade, also on our standing in the world, where if you, for instance, look back, let's say 60 years, the Europe's share of the global population was 20%, that is going to be well below 6% in a couple of generations. So that also forces Europe to rethink a little bit how it wants to position itself. If we look to the other axis there, that is a leading indicator that looks at the number of children that is being born. We've reached, as a world, we've reached what you can call peak child. The number of new children has passed its peak. And that, of course, is a leading indicator for the global population as a whole. So there will be growth, but that growth will be temporary, and after that there will be decline. And in some countries, that decline is really already on the horizon, most importantly in China, but also in Korea and Japan. So these are also things that really are going to shape geopolitics and global trade flows. And I think we come from a background of kind of trade growth and economic growth going hand in hand, and I think those days really are over. Then I think when I was at university and we were learning about ports, we didn't really talk too much about geopolitics. At that moment in time, it really wasn't there. It really was about, you know, economy, growth, projections, adaptations, technology, but geopolitics was really not in the equation. I think right now we live in a totally different world, where ports really are almost at the forefront of geopolitical struggles in many ways. I think all of the economic blocs have recognized that their ability to influence port development elsewhere can be very important for achieving geopolitical interest, especially talking about energy, especially talking about rare earth materials and contested materials in general. So that is really on the table. And then on top of that, there is a kind of a surge of state-owned enterprises. And state-owned enterprises are, in a way, strange animals, because they look like enterprises, but ultimately they're not. And we've been silent about that for a long period of time, but I think that silence is gone. The US, for instance, has put COSCO on a list of state-controlled enterprises, which is part of let's say, the military capabilities of COSCO. That I think, is a recognition of a reality that is there, which has important implications moving forward. Another aspect of these geopolitical kind of struggles has to do with the strategic autonomy. And again, I think when I grew up, we were really more talking about globalization and global sourcing, and I think now we're talking about strategic autonomy. And that is an ambition that Europe has, an ambition that the US has, an ambition that India has, China has, Brazil has, pretty much all economies have. And in that strategic autonomy, again, ports turn out to be very critical. They are really necessary elements of achieving more strategic autonomy. And then, of course, there's trade wars on the horizon, which will have an effect. So I think here as well, a careful analysis of geopolitics really is needed in order to have a good idea about how to move forward. Then, without going in too much detail, the overall dynamics in the transport industry also is impressive. And I think if you really wanted to summarize it quickly, then I think digitalization and verticalization are probably the most important underlying trends. I think the times when Maersk was a shipping line, or MSC was a shipping line, really are over. They're no longer a shipping line. That's not how they position themselves. The same applies for the leading terminal operators. They position themselves as logistics service providers from the fridge or from the factory to the fridge, so to say. And that verticalization, of course, has radical effect for ports. And on top of that, we are still in a phase where there have been local strong logistics companies that over time are being purchased by the larger global entities. So the ability of local companies to effectively play a role in these global value chains, I think, is diminishing over time. And we've seen in, for instance, West Africa and in Brazil, and recently, or more recently, in the north of Europe, we've seen how these local players are then purchased by these vertically integrated bigger players with important implications for port. So for ports, it really is all about inclusion. Being able to be included. And inclusion in the transport networks, inclusion in the corporate networks, and inclusion in the digital networks. And all of that is easy to say, but hard to do. And there, I think, just as an example of how these network choices can evolve over time, what you see over there is the newly announced schedule of Gemini, which is the new alliance between Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk. And this is interesting because I think historically in the container segment, Maersk has been a big driver of change. Many of the innovations have started out there. And this is, when you look at it, pretty innovative because lots of ports that previously were called directly are no longer called directly. And instead, it's a network with a much stronger focus on hubs and transshipment and reliability. If that is true, that means that for port, the implications are huge. Imagine that you are, for instance, the port of Gdansk, that prepared infrastructure for the big ships, and now all of a sudden you are faced with a network structure where the big ships are calling elsewhere, and then the cargo moves to you in different modes. That for ports is critical. So an understanding of how all of this plays out is really needed, and the ability to connect and to engage with these global verticalized and digitalized players is extremely important. On the digitalization, if you look at the billions and billions of venture that is poured into this market, it's also pretty obvious that all of that money is going to lead to radical change, and quite often to business models that will disrupt the industry. Flexport, I think, being the prime digital new logistics player, but there are many others as well. Then moving to the area of energy, I think it's pretty clear that there is still an incredible amount of uncertainty there. What you see here is the forecast in different scenarios that were made by the International Energy Agency, and they made a couple of different scenarios. One in which we will achieve net zero, which of course is the most radical transition path, and then another one which is called steps, in which they say, well, if we take the announced and implemented policies as a basis, where do we end up? And that shows you a major gap, right? So if we stick with the announced policies so far, then it's pretty clear that all of the ambitious targets that were set are not going to be met. And of course, the recent kind of developments give cause for concern. On the one hand, the US moving away from the environmental agenda, and on the other hand, the press notice from this morning that January of 2025 was the hottest ever, even though that wasn't supposed to be the case, because we have La Nina instead of El Nino, which the climate scientists thought would going to bring down temperatures. Didn't happen. So incredible amounts of uncertainty, and of course for ports, they need to be able to navigate that uncertainty. If we look more specifically for transport and also to maritime transport, the uncertainty that is there in the overall energy transition is also there when it comes to transport. There is a future marine fuel mix which is still pretty uncertain. There has been a strong focus also from the European Union to steer away from LNG as an intermediate fuel. That tide seems to have turned a little bit. Then there has been also a strong focus to work on hydrogen, but the cost competitiveness is that it continues to be challenging. So ports, as shipping lines, face difficult choices about the future fuel mix that they need to take into account moving forward. And as I said, the implications are huge. To give you one example, when it comes to the onshore power supply, the ultimate fuel mix also determines to what extent OPS is a permanent or a transition fuel. In some scenarios, in some ports, it may be more transitional than permanent. And of course, that has huge implications for the right way to approach investment. Then another transition that I think is overlooked at your peril, so to say, so that you really have to take into account, is the materials transition. There is a lot of focus on the energy transition for all the right reasons, but there is a materials transition on its way too. The demand for materials globally is going to continue to be there and is going to continue to grow. And a large part of that demand, of course, is coming from the emerging economies. So in order to cater for all of this, there is a strong logic to move on circularity. When it comes to circularity, this is one of those areas where Europe has been taking the lead, and where there is an ambitious policy to increase that. The potential really is there, because circularity levels still are relatively moderate. You see some figures over there about the circularity of the EU and a couple of countries. They don't really show that the Netherlands is doing great. They do show that the Netherlands is producing different types of end-of-life products. So it's not as if these differences are explained by being ahead or not. There are other underlying reasons. But still, they show that there is still a lot of end-of-life product that is either landfilled or burned, and there's potential to improve that. If you then look at construction as a big part of that, this is work that has been done by leading US universities to try and see how you can move ahead in this circularity of construction. And of course that involves moving to green steel, green cement, green aluminium, recycled to a large extent. So all of this is staring us in the face, right? So I think that is a bit the landscape, and I've stayed away from other important technologies. So this is the landscape in which ports operate. Uncertainty about the future of global trade, huge geopolitical struggles, a very high uncertainty when it comes to the energy transition, a materials transition that also has huge implications. And in all of this, ports need to steadily and with a lot of ambition fight for their ecosystems and fight to maintain vital ecosystems that actually help Europe defend its economy and the ability to create income. Okay, so because of all these changes, I have a couple of so what. What are the things that ports need to keep in mind moving forward? I think the first one really is that I think in ports there has been a tradition for a long time to kind of have somewhat linear ideas about port development and somewhat simple process, and I think incorporating uncertainty and scenarios in decision making is critical, right? Really trying to say what are the potential futures that we may have to operate in, and what are wise investments in either of those. Here you see a couple of scenarios that we've developed working for another Spanish port, and one important, I think, tool of these scenarios is that it can help you to think in terms of signposts. And a signpost would be something you can read in the news. And if we then think about what are the signposts, some things that you can read in the news, and then look at what we actually do read in the news, that gives you a bit of a sobering understanding of where we are. I think we are at the point where it's clear that there is not a very strong focus on global economic stability. Instead, I think we are in a kind of each country focus on its own interest type of environment. And when it comes to Europe, I think there is a serious concern that Europe isn't effectively leading industrial sectors that are needed to lead the sustainability transition. So I think this is a landscape in which taking cautious steps and carefully looking at are we really sure that these investments are going to pay off is critical. The other so what, as I see it, that ports are traditionally really focused on operations. So there are a lot of companies there that work hard every year to be, X% more productive and so on. But I think what ports need is the absorptive capacity, the ability to be able to use technologies that are developed elsewhere in port. And that requires innovation, right? And I think ports don't necessarily need R&D as much as they need absorptive capacity, being able to absorb all these technologies that are already out there. Is that a given? Is that an easy job? No, that's extremely complicated, and it requires, I think, a very strong ecosystem that allows resources to go into pilot projects, new experiments, new trials, working with new startups and all these kind of things. So I think, apart from getting the infrastructure right, a task for a port authority really also is getting the innovation ecosystem right. Then if we look at another so what, is the way I see it, I think there are some of the segments of the overall ecosystem that are very promising, and that there are other segments that are facing decline. And again, this requires careful choices, because ultimately the Port Authority is responsible for the overall ecosystem, and it needs to make choices to make sure that you move into activities that are vital for the future, and that you transition activities that need to be transitioned. And you see some examples here of the stuff that I think is in green. Then another so what, as I see it, in the transition of ecosystems, I think the asset that is most in demand is land. Land in the port area, right? And not so much land for terminals as land for logistics and industrial activities. If you work with new energies, then you need land for converting electricity and hydrogen, or you need land for biofuels, or you need land for logistics facilities. So there is a lot of demand for land, and ports need to turn into those. Then also, I think these ports in this environment need to focus on what are the new activities that I need to attract to my ecosystem, right? There are new things that need to be there and that you need to capture, and that's not always so straightforward. So there, again, ports have important choices to make. And then finally, and I think this is in a way the most, in a way, metaphorical of the conclusions. The way I see it, in a kind of European economy where industrial activities are complicated, ports are becoming islands, right? Metaphorical islands, places where things can be done, right? In isolated areas, often with specific regulation, with more than enough land. And these islands, to a large extent, drive the competitiveness of Europe. And we can see in other parts of the world that countries are developing such kind of port industrial islands as well. And I think ports are slowly and gradually turning into those. So the availability of land, the availability of sustainable energy are critical to that. Clear, accommodating and fast planning is also critical of that. And all of these things are relevant everywhere, but certainly, most certainly in ports. So the way I look at it, there really is a strong logic to say, okay, we need to look at the kind of development regime that we have for this port area and make sure that we treat this island differently when compared to the rest of the economy. Because this is a different territory. This is a place where we need the ability to move fast, attract investments, develop new things. So I think you see in some countries already regulation moving in that direction. Like, hey, let's understand that ports are these special ecosystems, and let's understand that then we need to put policies in place to safeguard the development potential of these ecosystems, because we need them. We need them for our European economy, for our energy independence, for our strategic autonomy, and so on and so forth. And that also, in my view, has implications for the port authorities. I actually don't like very much the term authority. I don't think that you have much meaningful authority when you try to develop your ecosystem. All you can do is work as hard as you can every day to get those investments going. But together with that challenge go the flexibility, also the commercial flexibility to develop new things, new synergy services. Can be OPS, can be a port community system, can be pipelines, can be energy generation, and so on and so forth. These European ports really need a business ecosystem developer that has the capabilities and the flexibility to fight day and night for a vital port. And I think in some countries that requires some tweaks and modifications of governance structures. And then finally, I think ports also have a challenge in terms of how to communicate their value. And I think they really need to actively communicate that they contribute to strategic autonomy, that they contribute to circularity, that they contribute to energy transitions, and also that they are vital in the earning capacity of the overall economy. So I think also there is really a logic for moving away from kind of the technical port economic impact studies to much more of a story about how ports create value. With all of that, I hope that I've evoked some food for thought, and I would like to thank you very much for your attention.
Peter de Langen, Ports and Logistics Advisory. Thank you so much. Very interesting conference.